A calm moment instantly turns tense as Matthew McConaughey fires back at Whoopi Goldberg. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn? One where a calm exchange slowly shifts into something more serious, more personal, and noticeably tense for everyone watching at home. Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice, and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. It begins the way many segments on The View typically do, measured, conversational, and centered around a timely topic that blends entertainment with broader cultural discussion. On this particular episode, the focus had gradually moved toward public figures speaking out on social issues and how their influence shapes public opinion. The tone at first was steady, even reflective, with each co-host offering a perspective that felt consistent with their usual on-air personalities. As the segment develops, Whoopi Goldberg takes a lead role in guiding the discussion. Her approach is familiar, direct, thoughtful, and grounded in experience. She frames the conversation in a way that invites nuance, asking whether celebrities should take stronger stances on political and social matters, or whether there's value in staying neutral and focusing on their craft. At this point, Matthew McConaughey is introduced into the discussion, already seated on the panel. His demeanor is calm, attentive. He's listening carefully, nodding slightly as the hosts speak. It's clear he's not preparing to interrupt, but rather waiting for the right moment to respond. The early exchange between them is respectful. McConaughey begins by acknowledging the complexity of the issue. He speaks in a measured tone, choosing his words carefully, emphasizing that public figures often face a difficult balance between authenticity and expectation. He explains that while speaking out can be powerful, it can also oversimplify deeply layered issues when reduced to sound bites. Whoopi listens closely, but there's a subtle shift in her posture. She leans slightly forward, her expression sharpening just a bit. When she responds, her tone remains controlled, but there's a clear firmness behind her words. She pushes back gently, suggesting that neutrality, especially in moments of social importance, can sometimes be interpreted as avoidance rather than balance. The conversation remains polite, but the tension becomes more noticeable. It's not loud or confrontational. This isn't that kind of moment, but it's the kind of shift that attentive viewers pick up on immediately. The pacing slows. There are fewer interruptions, but more pauses, as each person considers their next words more carefully. McConaughey responds again, this time slightly more direct. He clarifies that his perspective isn't about avoiding responsibility, but about encouraging deeper conversations rather than quick reactions. He gestures lightly with his hands as he speaks, reinforcing his point without raising his voice. His body language remains composed, but more engaged now. Whoopi, in turn, raises an important counterpoint. She questions whether waiting for deeper conversations sometimes delays necessary action. Her tone isn't aggressive, but it carries weight. She's not just speaking to McConaughey, she's speaking to the broader idea he represents. At this moment, the energy in the studio shifts again. The audience, which had been quietly attentive, reacts with a few scattered murmurs and light applause at certain remarks. It's not overwhelming, but it signals that viewers are recognizing the importance of what's being said. Another co-host briefly steps in, attempting to bridge the two perspectives. She acknowledges both viewpoints, highlighting that the responsibility of public figures is often debated, and that there may not be a single correct approach. This helps ease the tension slightly, but it doesn't fully dissolve it. McConaughey takes this opportunity to expand on his earlier point. He references the importance of listening before speaking, suggesting that public discourse benefits when people take the time to understand opposing viewpoints. His tone remains steady, but there's a noticeable emphasis now, his more deliberate, more precise. Whoopi responds with a subtle but meaningful shift in tone. She agrees with the value of listening, but adds that there are moments when silence can be misinterpreted, especially by those who are directly affected by the issues being discussed. Her words land with a certain gravity, and there's a brief pause afterward that underscores their impact. The camera cuts between them, capturing their expressions. McConaughey maintains eye contact, nodding slightly, showing that he's hearing her point. Whoopi's expression remains composed, but serious. There's no hostility, but there's a clear difference in perspective that neither is backing away from. What makes this moment stand out isn't raised voices or dramatic gestures, it's the restraint. Both are choosing to stay measured, to keep the conversation grounded, even as the disagreement becomes more defined. The host panel senses this, and there's a careful effort to keep the conversation balanced. Another co-host asks a follow-up question, redirecting slightly, but still within the same theme. She asks McConaughey how he personally decides when to speak out and when to step back. He answers thoughtfully, explaining that it often depends on whether he feels he can contribute meaningfully to the conversation. He emphasizes the importance of being informed, of not speaking just for the sake of being heard. His response is calm, but there's a quiet conviction behind it. Whoopi listens, then responds with a perspective rooted in lived experience. She points out that for some people, the issues being discussed aren't abstract, they're immediate and personal. In those cases, she suggests, waiting for the right moment to speak can feel like a delay that those affected simply can't afford. Again, there's a pause. The kind that only happens in live television when everyone in the room understands that something important has just been said. The audience reacts more noticeably this time, with a mix of applause and thoughtful silence. It's clear that both perspectives are resonating in different ways. As the segment continues, the conversation doesn't escalate into conflict, but it does become more focused. The disagreement is now clearly defined, not as a personal clash, but as a difference in how responsibility and timing are viewed. McConaughey leans slightly forward as he prepares to respond again, signaling that he's fully engaged in the discussion now. His tone remains respectful, but there's a seriousness that wasn't as present at the beginning of the segment. And as he begins to speak, it's evident that this exchange, while still calm and controlled, has moved beyond a simple discussion. It has become a moment where two perspectives are being carefully, openly examined in real time, with the audience watching closely. The kind of moment that doesn't rely on volume or spectacle, but instead on clarity, presence, and the willingness to stay in the conversation even when it becomes uncomfortable. As the conversation continues, the tone remains composed, but there's a clear sense that both Matthew McConaughey and Whoopi Goldberg understand they've reached a point where the discussion requires more precision, not less. The earlier exchange has set the foundation, and now the focus shifts toward clarifying what each of them truly means, beyond the general statements and into something more specific. McConaughey resumes his point with a steady voice, leaning slightly forward in his chair. He acknowledges what Whoopi said about urgency, making it clear that he doesn't disagree with the idea that certain moments call for immediate attention. But he carefully draws a distinction. He explains that his concern lies in how quickly public conversations can become reactive rather than constructive. He suggests that when people, especially those with influence, respond too quickly, there's a risk of adding noise instead of clarity. Whoopi listens without interrupting, but her expression shows she's processing every word. When he finishes, she responds in a way that keeps the conversation grounded but firm. She points out that while thoughtful responses are important, the expectation for public figures to show awareness and empathy in real time has grown significantly. She notes that audiences today are more engaged, more aware, and often looking for reassurance that the people they admire are paying attention. There's no overlap in their voices, no talking over each other. Instead, the rhythm of the conversation slows even further, with each response followed by a brief pause. It's the kind of pacing that signals mutual respect, but also careful consideration. One of the co-hosts steps in again, this time asking a question that reflects what many viewers might be thinking. She asks whether the difference between them is really about timing, or if it's about responsibility, specifically, whether public figures have an obligation to speak, or if it should remain a personal choice. McConaughey answers first. He says that while he believes in responsibility, he also believes in individuality. He explains that not every voice contributes in the same way, and that forcing a uniform response from everyone can sometimes dilute the impact of those who are deeply informed or directly involved. His tone remains even, but there's a slight emphasis on certain words, suggesting that this is a point he feels strongly about. Whoopi responds by reframing the idea of responsibility. She agrees that individuality matters, but adds that visibility comes with a certain level of accountability. She doesn't raise her voice, but her words carry a quiet weight. She emphasizes that when someone has a platform, their silence can be just as noticeable as their speech. At this moment, the audience reaction becomes more noticeable again. There's a brief round of applause following her comment, not overwhelming, but enough to indicate agreement from some in the room. McConaughey nods slightly, acknowledging the reaction without letting it shift his focus. The conversation then takes a slightly more personal turn. McConaughey shares an example from his own experience, describing a situation where he chose to wait before speaking publicly on an issue. He explains that his intention was to take time to understand the full context, to listen to different perspectives, and to ensure that when he did speak, it would be meaningful rather than impulsive. As he speaks, his body language remains composed, hands loosely clasped at times, occasionally gesturing to emphasize a point. His tone is consistent, calm, and deliberate. Whoopi listens, then responds with a perspective that highlights the other side of that same scenario. She acknowledges the value of reflection, but points out that for people directly affected by certain issues, waiting can feel like a lack of support. She explains that even a simple acknowledgement can matter, even if a more detailed response comes later. There's a subtle shift in the room at this point. The conversation isn't becoming louder or more heated, but it is becoming more layered. Both perspectives are now clearly defined, and neither is being dismissed. Another co-host adds to the discussion, noting that the role of public figures has evolved over time. She mentions that in today's media landscape, silence is often interpreted in ways that it might not have been in the past. This observation seems to resonate with both sides, and for a brief moment, the tension softens. McConaughey picks up on that point, agreeing that expectations have changed. He acknowledges that public figures are now part of a constant, real-time conversation. However, he reiterates that this shift doesn't necessarily make immediate responses more effective. He suggests that there's still value in taking a step back, even in a fast-moving environment. Whoopi responds by bringing the focus back to impact. She explains that while thoughtful responses are important, visibility during key moments can provide reassurance and solidarity. Her tone remains steady, but there's a sense of urgency in her words that contrasts with McConaughey's more measured approach. The camera briefly cuts to the other co-hosts, who are listening closely. Their expressions reflect the balance of the conversation. No one is visibly taking sides, but it's clear that the discussion is meaningful. The audience remains engaged, reacting at key moments with light applause or quiet murmurs. It's not a divided reaction, but rather a thoughtful one, as if people are considering both perspectives in real time. As the exchange continues, McConaughey shifts slightly in his seat, signaling that he's about to respond in a more direct way. He clarifies that his position isn't about avoiding difficult conversations, but about ensuring that when those conversations happen, they are productive. He emphasizes that speaking without full understanding can sometimes lead to unintended consequences. Whoopi listens, then responds with a concise but impactful statement. She says that while understanding is important, there are moments when showing up, even without all the answers, can make a difference. Her delivery is calm, but there's a firmness that underscores her point. There's a brief pause after she speaks, and the audience reacts again, this time with slightly stronger applause. It's clear that her perspective is resonating with many in the room. McConaughey nods again, acknowledging her point. He doesn't interrupt, and when he does speak, his tone remains consistent. He agrees that presence matters, but adds that how that presence is expressed is equally important. He suggests that there's a balance to be found, though he admits that it's not always easy to define. At this stage, the conversation has reached a kind of equilibrium. The tension hasn't disappeared, but it has stabilized. Both sides have articulated their views clearly, and the discussion has moved beyond simple disagreement into a more nuanced exploration of the topic. The co-hosts recognize this shift and begin to guide the conversation toward a broader perspective. One of them asks how audiences should interpret the actions, or inactions, of public figures, given the complexities that have just been discussed. This question opens the door for both McConaughey and Whoopi to step slightly outside their earlier positions and reflect on the bigger picture. McConaughey speaks about the importance of critical thinking, encouraging audiences not to rely solely on public figures for guidance, but to engage with issues independently. Whoopi follows by emphasizing the importance of accountability, noting that while audiences should think for themselves, public figures still play a role in shaping conversations. As they speak, the earlier tension gives way to a more collaborative tone. It's not that they've resolved their differences, but they've found a way to coexist within the conversation. The audience response reflects this shift. The applause is more balanced now, less reactive and more appreciative of the discussion as a whole. And as the segment continues, it becomes clear that what started as a simple question has evolved into something more substantial. A thoughtful, measured exchange that highlights the complexity of modern public discourse, without losing the respectful tone that defines the show. But even with this more balanced energy, there's still a sense that the conversation isn't quite finished, that there's one more layer to explore, one more perspective to consider, before the segment can fully move forward. As the discussion carries forward, there's a noticeable shift in how both Matthew McConaughey and Whoopi Goldberg approach their responses. The earlier back and forth, while still calm and respectful, has now evolved into something more reflective. Instead of simply responding to each other's points, they begin to examine the broader implications of what they've been discussing, almost as if both are aware that the audience is not just listening for opinions, but for clarity. McConaughey takes a slightly longer pause before speaking this time. He leans back briefly, then forward again, as if organizing his thoughts. When he begins, his tone remains steady, but there's a deeper level of intention behind his words. He explains that part of his perspective comes from observing how quickly conversations can become polarized. He mentions that when discussions move too fast, people often stop listening and start reacting, and that's where meaningful dialogue begins to break down. He doesn't rush through his explanation. There's a deliberate pacing, and the studio becomes noticeably quieter as he speaks. Even the co-hosts, who had occasionally interjected earlier, now allow him the space to fully articulate his point. Whoopi listens closely, her expression serious but not closed off. When he finishes, she doesn't respond immediately. There's a brief pause, one of those moments that feels longer on live television than it actually is. Then she leans slightly forward and begins to speak, her tone measured but carrying a different kind of emphasis. She acknowledges what he's saying about polarization, agreeing that it's a real concern. But she adds that for many people, the urgency of certain issues doesn't allow for extended reflection. She explains that when something directly impacts people's lives, the expectation for acknowledgement isn't about creating division. It's about recognizing reality in real time. The distinction she draws adds another layer to the conversation. It's no longer just about when to speak, but about how different groups experience the same moment differently. The audience reacts with a soft murmur, followed by a few nods and scattered applause. One of the co-hosts steps in again, this time framing the discussion in a slightly different way. She asks whether the real challenge is not just about timing or responsibility, but about communication, specifically, how public figures can express themselves in ways that are both thoughtful and responsive. This question seems to resonate with both sides. McConaughey nods slightly, then responds by saying that communication is exactly where the balance needs to be found. He explains that it's not about choosing between silence and speaking out, but about how and when those responses are delivered. He suggests that there may be a way to acknowledge situations early, while still taking the time to offer deeper insight later. Whoopi responds to that idea with a slight nod of her own, signaling a moment of agreement. She says that acknowledging something in the moment doesn't mean having all the answers, it simply means showing awareness. Her tone softens slightly here, not in a way that reduces the seriousness of her point, but in a way that opens the door for common ground. The energy in the room shifts again, this time toward a more collaborative tone. The earlier tension hasn't disappeared, but it's no longer the defining feature of the conversation. Instead, there's a sense that both perspectives are being woven together into something more complete. Another co-host adds to the discussion by bringing in the audience perspective. She mentions that viewers often look to public figures not just for opinions, but for signals, small indications that they are engaged, informed, and present. This observation seems to bridge the gap between the two viewpoints. McConaughey responds by agreeing with that idea, but he adds a nuance. He explains that while signals are important, they should still be grounded in authenticity. He emphasizes that audiences can often tell when a response is rushed or insincere, and that this can undermine the very connection people are trying to build. Whoopi listens, then responds with a perspective that builds on that point. She agrees that authenticity matters, but she adds that authenticity doesn't always require perfection. She explains that sometimes, simply showing up honestly, even if the message isn't fully formed, can be more meaningful than waiting for the perfect statement. There's a brief moment where both perspectives seem to align more closely than before. The audience reacts with a more unified round of applause, signaling that this middle ground is resonating. As the conversation continues, the pacing becomes more fluid again. The pauses are still there, but they feel less tense and more reflective. The co-hosts appear more relaxed, allowing the discussion to flow naturally rather than carefully managing each exchange. McConaughey takes another moment to share a personal reflection, this time speaking more openly about how he approaches these situations in his own life. He explains that he often asks himself whether his voice will add value to the conversation, and if so, how he can contribute in a way that encourages understanding rather than division. His tone remains calm, but there's a sincerity that comes through more strongly now. It's less about defending a position and more about explaining a mindset. Whoopi responds by sharing her own approach. She explains that for her, the decision to speak is often guided by a sense of responsibility to those who may not have the same platform. She emphasizes that visibility can be a form of support, even when the message is simple. The exchange at this point feels less like a disagreement and more like a comparison of perspectives. Both are speaking from experience, and both are being given the space to do so. The audience remains engaged, reacting with thoughtful silence at times and light applause at others. It's clear that the conversation has moved beyond initial reactions and into something more substantive. One of the co-hosts then brings the discussion back to the broader cultural context, noting that the expectations placed on public figures are unlikely to decrease anytime soon. She asks how both McConaughey and Whoopi think this dynamic will evolve in the future. McConaughey responds by suggesting that the key will be adaptability. He explains that as the media landscape continues to change, public figures will need to find ways to stay authentic while also being responsive. He acknowledges that it's not an easy balance, but one that will become increasingly important. Whoopi follows by emphasizing the importance of consistency. She explains that audiences tend to respond more positively when they understand where someone stands, even if they don't always agree. Her point adds another layer to the discussion, highlighting the role of trust in these interactions. As they speak, the early attention feels like a distant starting point rather than the central focus. The conversation has evolved into something more nuanced, more balanced, and more reflective of the complexities involved. The co-hosts begin to subtly guide the segment toward its next phase, but there's still a sense that one final clarification, or perhaps one final exchange, could bring the discussion to a more complete conclusion. McConaughey shifts slightly in his seat again, as if preparing to offer one more thought. Whoopi watches him closely, her expression attentive and composed. The audience quiets once more, anticipating what comes next. And in that moment, it's clear that while the tone has softened, the importance of the conversation hasn't diminished. If anything, it has deepened, moving from a simple exchange of viewpoints into a thoughtful exploration of how those viewpoints can coexist in a space that demands both immediacy and reflection. As the segment moves into what feels like its final stretch, both Matthew McConaughey and Whoopi Goldberg appear more settled in the conversation, but not disengaged. If anything, their focus sharpens. There's a sense that each of them wants to leave the audience with something clear, something that reflects not just their position, but the reasoning behind it. McConaughey takes the cue to continue, his tone steady but slightly more direct than earlier. He begins to tie together the points he's made throughout the discussion, emphasizing that his perspective has never been about withholding support or avoiding responsibility. Instead, he frames it as a question of effectiveness, how to contribute in a way that leads to understanding rather than simply adding to the volume of voices. As he speaks, his delivery is calm, but there's a quiet emphasis that suggests he's aware of how his words are being interpreted. He briefly glances toward the other co-hosts, then back to Whoopi, maintaining a respectful and engaged posture. Whoopi listens without interruption, her expression thoughtful. When he finishes, she nods slightly, acknowledging his point before responding. Her tone is measured, but there's a renewed firmness in her delivery. She reiterates that while effectiveness matters, visibility carries its own form of impact, especially in moments when audiences are looking for reassurance, not just analysis. There's no sharp edge to her words, but there is clarity. She isn't challenging him personally. She's reinforcing a principle she believes is important. The distinction is subtle, but it keeps the conversation grounded. One of the co-hosts steps in at this point, sensing that the discussion has reached a meaningful depth. She asks a question that brings the focus back to the audience. How should viewers interpret these different approaches in real time? Should they expect immediate responses from public figures, or should they allow space for more thoughtful engagement? McConaughey answers first, acknowledging that expectations are naturally high, especially in today's media environment. He explains that while immediate responses can provide reassurance, they don't always offer clarity. He suggests that audiences might benefit from allowing space for both, initial acknowledgement followed by more considered perspectives. Whoopi responds by building on that idea, but with a slight shift in emphasis. She agrees that there can be room for both, but she stresses that the initial acknowledgement shouldn't be overlooked or delayed. Her tone remains consistent, but there's a sense of urgency that underscores her words. The audience reacts again, this time with a more balanced response. There's applause, but it's not directed solely at one viewpoint. Instead, it feels like recognition of the conversation as a whole, an appreciation for the way both perspectives are being presented. As the exchange continues, McConaughey makes a point that brings the discussion into sharper focus. He explains that part of his concern is how easily messages can be misunderstood when they are delivered too quickly. He notes that once something is said publicly, it can take on a life of its own, often beyond the speaker's original intent. His tone remains calm, but there's a seriousness that reflects the weight of what he's saying. He's no longer just explaining his position. He's outlining the potential consequences of getting it wrong. Whoopi listens, then responds with a perspective that complements rather than contradicts his point. She acknowledges that misinterpretation is always a risk, but she adds that silence can also be misinterpreted. Her delivery is concise, but impactful. She's not dismissing his concern. She's expanding the conversation to include another dimension. There's a brief pause after she speaks, and the camera captures the reactions around the table. The co-hosts appear thoughtful, taking in both sides of the argument. The audience remains attentive, the earlier energy now replaced with a quieter, more reflective engagement. Another co-host offers a brief observation, noting that what they are really discussing is a balance between intention and perception. She points out that public figures may have clear intentions, but those intentions are always filtered through public interpretation. This observation seems to resonate with both McConaughey and Whoopi. McConaughey nods slightly, acknowledging the point before adding that this is exactly why he values taking time to communicate carefully. He emphasizes that intention matters, but so does how that intention is received. Whoopi responds by agreeing, but she brings the focus back to immediacy. She explains that perception is often shaped in the moment, and that initial responses can set the tone for how everything that follows is understood. The conversation at this stage feels less like a disagreement and more like a layered discussion, where each point adds to the overall picture. The earlier tension has evolved into something more constructive, an exploration of how different approaches can coexist, even if they don't fully align. McConaughey takes a moment to offer what feels like a closing thought. He explains that for him, the goal is always to contribute in a way that encourages dialogue rather than division. He acknowledges that this approach may not always meet immediate expectations, but he believes it can lead to more meaningful conversations over time. His tone is calm, but there's a sense of finality in his words, as if he's summarizing his position for the audience. Whoopi follows with her own closing perspective. She reiterates the importance of presence and visibility, emphasizing that showing up, especially in critical moments, can have a powerful impact, even if the message is simple. Her delivery is steady, but there's a quiet conviction that underscores her point. The audience responds with a strong round of applause, not directed at one side or the other, but at the exchange itself. It's clear that the conversation has resonated, not because it reached a definitive conclusion, but because it explored the issue in a thoughtful and balanced way. The co-hosts begin to transition the segment, offering brief reflections that highlight the key points discussed. Their tone is lighter now, signaling a shift away from the intensity of the conversation, but they remain respectful of what just took place. As the camera pulls back slightly, both McConaughey and Whoopi share a brief, acknowledging glance. It's a small moment, but it reflects the tone of the entire exchange, serious, respectful, and grounded in a genuine effort to understand. The audience settles as the segment nears its end, but there's a lingering sense that what was discussed will continue beyond the studio. The kind of conversation that doesn't end when the cameras stop, but carries forward into how viewers think about the topic in their own lives. And as the show prepares to move on, it's clear that this wasn't just another segment. It was a moment of real dialogue, handled with care, clarity, and a level of respect that allowed both perspectives to be heard without losing the tone of the show itself. As the segment begins to wrap up, the atmosphere in the studio feels noticeably different from where it started. What began as a routine discussion on The View has gradually unfolded into something more layered, something that held the audience's attention not through intensity, but through clarity and restraint. Both Matthew McConaughey and Whoopi Goldberg remain composed, but there's a subtle sense of closure in their body language, as if they both understand the conversation has reached its natural endpoint. One of the co-hosts steps in to formally guide the segment to a close, thanking McConaughey for joining the discussion and acknowledging the depth of the exchange. Her tone is warm and appreciative, signaling to the audience that while the conversation touched on serious points, it remained within the respectful boundaries expected of the show. McConaughey responds with a brief nod and a calm expression, offering a few final words. He reiterates, in a concise way, that conversations like this are necessary, even when they don't result in complete agreement. His voice is steady, and his message is simple. The goal isn't to resolve every difference, but to keep the dialogue open. Whoopi follows with a closing remark of her own, keeping her tone consistent with everything she's said throughout the segment. She emphasizes that conversations like this matter because they reflect real differences in how people see the world. Her words are measured, but there's a quiet emphasis that reinforces her perspective on presence and responsibility. The audience responds with a sustained round of applause, stronger than at any earlier point in the segment. It's not directed at a single comment or viewpoint, but at the exchange as a whole. The applause carries for a few seconds longer than usual, suggesting that viewers in the room recognize the significance of what they just witnessed. As the camera pans slightly across the table, the co-hosts share small, acknowledging smiles. There's no sense of unresolved tension, only the understanding that the discussion was handled thoughtfully. McConaughey and Whoopi exchange a brief glance again, a subtle but clear sign of mutual respect despite their differing perspectives. The show transitions to its next segment, but the energy doesn't immediately reset. There's a lingering sense that something meaningful just took place. Even as the hosts begin introducing the next topic, the audience remains slightly quieter than usual, as if still processing the conversation. Off camera, and in the minutes following the broadcast, the moment begins to take on a life of its own. Viewers who watched live start discussing the exchange across social media platforms. Clips of the conversation begin circulating, with many focusing on the calm but firm nature of the disagreement. Some viewers express support for McConaughey's emphasis on thoughtful communication, appreciating his focus on clarity and intention. Others resonate more strongly with Whoopi's perspective, highlighting the importance of visibility and immediate acknowledgement during critical moments. What stands out in these reactions is that the discussion doesn't become divisive. It remains, much like the segment itself, grounded in differing but respectfully presented viewpoints. Media outlets and online commentators begin referencing the exchange as an example of how complex topics can be handled on live television without escalating into conflict. There's recognition of the way both individuals maintained composure, allowing the conversation to unfold naturally rather than forcing resolution. In follow-up discussions, both on air in later episodes and in interviews outside the show, the moment is occasionally revisited. Co-hosts reflect on the balance that was struck, noting that while not every conversation reaches that level of depth, this one did so because of the willingness on both sides to listen as much as they spoke. McConaughey, in a later interview, briefly references the appearance, reiterating that his intention was simply to contribute thoughtfully. He doesn't frame the exchange as a disagreement, but as a conversation, one that reflects the broader challenges of public discourse today. Whoopi, in her own remarks during a subsequent episode, echoes a similar sentiment. She acknowledges that not every conversation leads to agreement, but emphasizes that understanding different perspectives is part of what makes discussions like these valuable. Back in the studio, as the original episode continues airing, the audience settles fully into the next segment, but the earlier discussion remains a clear highlight of the show. It's the kind of moment that doesn't rely on dramatic confrontation, but instead leaves an impression through its authenticity. For viewers watching at home, the impact is similar. The exchange doesn't demand a single takeaway, it invites reflection. It encourages viewers to consider how they interpret silence, how they value immediacy, and how they define responsibility in a world where public voices carry significant weight. As the episode comes to a close, the tone returns to the familiar rhythm of daytime television. But the earlier conversation stands apart, not because it was louder or more dramatic, but because it was handled with a level of care that allowed both sides to be heard clearly. And in the end, that's what makes the moment resonate. Not a clear winner, not a final answer, but a conversation that stayed grounded, respectful, and real from beginning to end. If you watch this exchange, or if you're hearing about it now, the question becomes part of the experience. Where do you stand on it? Do you believe in speaking immediately, or taking time to respond thoughtfully? There's no single answer, and that's exactly what made this discussion worth watching. Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.